Welcome to week 10 of Mondays with Missy. I have two chapters to read to you today. Before I do that, I will start with my book-related t-shirt. Today's t-shirt is a Woodstock t-shirt, which if you check out my second book, you will see the connection there. Cross Country is about Betts' trip from California to New York to attend the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. So a little bit of a hint as to what's to come after Missy. I put two links in the comments of this week's video. One to Bethel Woods, which is the site of the original Woodstock Festival. There is now a performing arts center there. So if you want to actually see where Woodstock happened, you can take a look at Bethel Woods, and they do have performances there. So you get to see the original field, and there's actually a Woodstock museum there. So cool stuff at Bethel Woods. And then the other link is a little bit of info about the trip that I took to Bethel Woods last year for the Woodstock 50-year anniversary. So I've got some pictures up there and a little bit about what we did and what we saw in Bethel Woods to celebrate 50 years of Woodstock. All right, so this week's chapters, I have two the first chapter is a little kind of short. Two chapters to read today. The first chapter is called Letters. And this chapter, I guess in planning out the storyline for Miss E, one of the things I wanted to do with this chapter was kind of draw the parallel between where Miss E is in the story and Bet's kind of wanting her to get beyond this place where she feels stuck and where she feels like she can't do anything, and actually hopefully continue her flight and finish her world flight, and then at the same time Bet's kind of feeling stuck and struggling with having these new opinions and having these thoughts about the war, but at the same time not really feeling like she can do anything about it, or not really knowing what to do about it. So in this short little chapter, Letters, we kind of see a little bit of both sides of that. Letters. I parked my bike in front of the library after school the next day. The librarian looked a little surprised when she saw me. After a constant stream of biography hunting ninth graders, the library had turned into a peaceful recluse in comparison. I lifted a hand in greeting and pulled my backpack strap further up on my shoulder as if to indicate that I was there for school business. She dropped her eyes and went back to stamping due dates on book inserts. I found my way to the biography section and ran my fingers along the book spines, reciting the alphabet backwards, working my way toward the E's. The book I was looking for was easy to find. It had been on my desk long enough that I recognized the color and lettering. I pulled it from the shelf and walked back toward the checkout desk. Even though the librarian had no way of knowing what I had planned for the book, I felt guilty. She slipped in one of the due date cards she'd been stamping and then flipped the book over to look at the cover. "Pity about that Earhart woman," she said, not bothering to lift her eyes to look up at me. We were ready for a celebration, being so close to her takeoff and landing spot. I suppose all that's left of her now is in the history books, huh? She slid the book along the desk toward me as if to punctuate her point, and then turned back to her work. I left the library slowly, thinking about what Miss E had said the day before and wondering how the woman behind the desk would react to Amelia Earhart's return. I walked down Front Street with the same thought in mind. glancing at the people who passed me on the sidewalk and gauging what their reaction might be. I hadn't really thought about it until the librarian mentioned it, but the older people in town were probably living in the area when Miss E made her world flight. They might even have driven down to Oakland to watch her take off or made plans to watch her land. For them, finding out that Amelia Earhart was still alive and living just outside of town would have been pretty exciting. Like that celebration they were ready for but never had. But for most of the town, those people who were my parents' age or younger, and the kids like me, Amelia Earhart was just someone from the history books, like the librarian said. Would we give her any more attention than we gave our history books? These new thoughts made me even more resolved to see my plan through. I walked a block or two from the library. I suppose I could have taken care of things right there on one of the benches in front of the library building, but it didn't feel right. I ended up on a bench near the bulletin board where the outdated yard sale flyer still hung. I sat there for a few minutes, watching people walk by before I opened the book. I flipped to the middle and found the page that I knew was there, the page that folded out into a full-sized map of Amelia Earhart's route around the world. Then I tugged at it gently until its edge pulled free from the pages on either side. I gradually tore the page out, careful to get all of it and not leave any torn edges behind. When I was finished, no evidence of the extra map page remained between pages 57 and 58, and someone checking the book out after me would never guess that it had been there. I dug through my backpack for a pen, and then I drew a thin black line from Howland Island in the Pacific diagonally up to Hawaii, and then further still to Oakland, California. And then in block, all caps, print, as neat as I could manage, I wrote a sentence that followed the route, with the bottoms of the letters not quite touching the line I'd just drawn, then underlined 2 of the words. Why do you care what they think? I bought an envelope and a stamp at the post office and wrote the address I knew by heart. The map had been folded to fit the size of the book, and I had to unfold and refold a couple times before I got it to fit flat in the envelope. I dropped my letter in the mailbox on my way out of the post office, and then, as a gesture that completed my task entirely, I walked back to the library and let the Amelia Earhart book, now 1 page thinner, slide into the book deposit slot outside the main doors. 3 days later, a letter arrived for me. Although I checked the mailbox when I arrived home from school most days, I didn't normally get mail. I always just brought in the mail from my mother, most days not even looking at what it was, unless there was a letter from my father. Other than a few birthday cards from aunts and uncles I'd never met, I couldn't remember ever having seen an envelope addressed to me. I would have put the letter on the kitchen counter like I did any other day, except that I noticed the crossed out address and was curious enough to take a look. There, in my handwriting, was Miss E's address, crossed out. And then, written below it in a much neater script, was my name, and below that, my own address. I hadn't bothered writing a return address. I figured Miss E would know who the letter had come from. Miss E hadn't bothered either. I slipped a finger inside the envelope and tore it open. Reaching in, I could tell there was more in there than a letter, and by the time I had it only partially pulled out, I realized it was a map, but it wasn't the map I tore out of the book. That was easy to see right away. Not a world map, no oceans, no continents, mostly streets laid out in a grid pattern, rimmed by water. San Francisco. And toward the top right of the map was a circle in red ink. I had to look closely to see what it was at its center, City Hall. Next to the circle, in the same red ink and the same neat script that adorned the envelope, were 3 words, the third one underlined. Why do you? All right. So on to the next chapter. The next chapter is called Protest, which, given everything that is going on right now in our country, is a pretty fitting chapter to read this week. One thing that has always surprised me about Miss E is when I wrote the book, I really, in terms of protests, I really felt like I was writing about history. Protests were something that happened back in the 60s. And that was kind of how I was thinking of them. And, in the time that it took me to write the book and in the time that the book has been out there, protests are now something that we see a lot of, especially living outside the Washington, D.C. area. We see a lot of protests. My daughter is in high school, and she's always asking, can I skip school to go to this week's protest? Which I kind of admire, but at the same time, I'm not sure she should be skipping school for that. But anyway, it's interesting to see. A lot of times we as an English teacher, I would talk about books and ask my students, what do you think the author wanted us to get out of this, or what was the author thinking when she wrote this? And a lot of times, our interpretation, or what we find important in a book, is not necessarily what the author put into it. And I like that. I like that we can kind of take what's happening in our world and what's important to us, and find that in a book. So even though when I wrote Missy, I wasn't thinking about protests as a current event or as a present day thing. I really appreciate that someone can read it now and find that relevance and make that personal connection. And then in terms of story for this chapter, the thing that stands out to me is this is really the chapter where Beth's, where things stop happening to Beth's and she starts doing something. So far, she's had a lot that's happened to her, and she's had a lot that she's kind of reacting to. But this chapter stands out to me as a time when she really kind of decides to take charge of the situation and take some action for herself. So here's Protest. I spent the evening reading Emmy Hatcher's journal. Well, I didn't really read it. Not all the pages, not all the words. I'd already made up my mind that the journal was off limits, but I skimmed it. I looked for answers. I wanted to know why Emmy ended up where she did on that day in San Francisco. What made her decide to come to City Hall? What caused her to run into the building when the police came, instead of running away like some on the fringes of the crowd had done? Why was Emmy pulled into the fire, or had she thrown herself in? She was only a few years older than me. She seemed like someone I could share a pizza with at Sonny's, and I guessed that if we flipped through each other's record albums, we'd find a lot of duplicates. But until my trip to San Francisco, I didn't even know there was anything to protest about. So how did a person go from innocent high school student to Vietnam War protester in just a few years? Plus, there was another question I wanted answered, and I was pretty sure if I found the answer to that one, all the others would fall into place. On Emmy's bag, there was a small American flag. Lots of people had flag patches. They sewed them onto everything, right next to their peace signs, but Emmy's was different. I knew right where it came from, and it had no business being on her bag. Emmy's flag belonged on a United States Army uniform. But when I was still small enough to sit on my father's lap, he would show me each of the emblems on his uniform and explain what they were. The ones that showed his rank, the ones he received for special honors, and the flag. The flag was my favorite. And after he was finished, I'd rest my head on his shoulder and try to count the tiny stars. So Emmy's flag could have come from her father's uniform, or maybe an older brother's. It crossed my mind that it could be a boyfriend's, but most boys Emmy's age were going out of their way to avoid going to Vietnam. They certainly wouldn't be volunteering. It didn't really matter who the flag came from, though. I'd seen how my father took care of his uniform. He'd have my mother fix buttons that seemed perfectly fine to me. He wouldn't leave the house until it was perfect. And I'd been on base and knew he wasn't the only one. So the only way Emmy could get an American flag off someone's uniform was if the person wasn't wearing it anymore. And I had a pretty good guess why. So I skimmed her journal. I found the answers I was looking for, and I decided what I needed to do next. The day Al Molino held the pep rally, I wore a sweatshirt to school. I would have been more comfortable without it, but the day wasn't so warm that I stood out wearing it. During the entire school day, I don't think anyone even noticed me. That was the point. The pep rally was scheduled for the last hour of the day. Teachers grumbled about it in most of my classes because they'd skimmed minutes off of each period, so we'd end up going to all our classes but finish with time left in the school day for the rally. While they used up precious minutes writing on the chalkboard or passing out papers, teachers mumbled things like "no time for instruction" or "disrupts the flow of my lesson." The football players and the cheerleaders were all wearing their uniforms, and they were chatting between classes and at lunches about what would be happening at the rally. Most kids just thought it was cool to have shorter classes. After the last class of the day, students tossed books in lockers and started flowing into the gym. I walked faster than others, squeezing around and between until I got to the double doors leading into the gym. I had a brief memory of San Francisco as the people in front slowed to get through the doors while the people behind kept closing in. I pushed aside the memory and squeezed through the door. I wanted a good seat. I ended up in the third row of the center section of the bleachers. I was in plain view of the kids on the opposite side of the gym, and if I stood up, the kids behind me couldn't help but see me. My seat was perfect for what I had in mind. We had a rally in the fall before the big football game, and another halfway through the school year when the basketball team had nearly made it to regionals, but no one was entirely sure what we were rallying for today. The guys on the football and basketball teams all sat together, and they seemed to have come in as a group with their arms raised and smiles on their faces after most of the other students had been seated, but they tended to do that anyway, traveling in the halls in groups and coming into class last minute so they could be seen by everyone. The school had a baseball team, but they were struggling to get on base, let alone fill the bleachers. I guess if anyone needed the student body to rally behind them, it was the baseball team. The principal spoke briefly, reminding students to behave themselves and demonstrate self-control, even if they were brimming with school pride. Then he passed the microphone over to Miss Hess, the English teacher in charge of the student council. She was flanked on either side by the class president and vice president, two seniors whose names I didn't know, even though I think they managed to introduce themselves to everyone in the cafeteria while elections were going on. I shifted in my seat, waiting for the right moment. Half the kids on the bleachers were talking or nodding off, so I needed something that would at least keep their attention for a little while. I fiddled with the zipper on my sweatshirt and thumbed the corner of the notebook on my lap. When a blare of horns and the thump of a drum caused an audible gasp, I knew the time had come. The marching band was coming in through the two sets of double doors. Two lines through each door merged into a column of four that stepped rhythmically toward the other side of the gym and then turned in unison to face away from the students on my side and then toward them. The space around us was filled with their slightly tuneless rendition of the school's fight song. Conversation was impossible, and many an afternoon nap was cut short. It was time. I stood up. I unzipped my sweatshirt, shook it from my shoulders, and let it slide off my arms and drop onto my seat, revealing the white t-shirt I'd worn to San Francisco, still covered in Emmy Hatcher's blood. I flipped my notebook open to the spot with the folded over corner, the one where I had written the words "No War" in dark capital letters on one page and then again on the facing page. Folding the notebook completely open, I ended up with a two-sided sign. I held it over my head so I could be seen by the students across the gym as well as those behind me. Then I stepped up onto my seat just to be sure everyone could see me. At first, the only reaction came from the students around me, those on either side leaning away from me and craning their necks to figure out what the heck I was doing. Then a few shouts from behind, "Hey!" and "Down in front!" Then the pointing started on the other side of the gym. It was like a ripple on water. Someone would point, elbow the person next to them, and then point at me again. Then it would carry on with the next person, left and right, up and down. The crowd on my side couldn't see my bloody t-shirt, just my sign, and those on the sides couldn't even see that. But they could see the reaction on the other side of the gym, and students in the bleachers beside me were flowing down to the gym floor to get a better look. The band was too focused on their performance to notice anything. They marched on, blaring their out of tune, until teachers who had been checking their watches and shifting their weight from foot to foot seconds ago realized what was going on and ran out with arms waving in a downward motion, like they were pushing the sound of the instruments to the floor. Horns squeaked and drums rattled to a stop, while some marchers, their eyes focused on the music in front of them, ran into others. There was a split second of near silence before the murmuring voices grew to a crescendo. Teachers became sheep herders, trying to direct the crowd of students out of the gym, while all they wanted to do was gawk at me. The principal's head snapped from side to side. He shouted at students, he shouted at teachers, he waved his arms as if signaling to a plane landing on an aircraft carrier. No one thought to run up to me, pull the notebook out of my hands, and wrap my sweatshirt around me. Instead, they shooed students out of the gym as if it were filled with something contagious. But really, that's exactly what I was hoping for. I had something that I needed everyone to catch. From where I sat in the principal's office, I could see out the window and watch as students piled on buses to leave school. There were some juniors and seniors who drove themselves, and some kids who lived close enough to walk. In less than 10 minutes, the sidewalks and the bus loop in front of school were empty and silent. I had been asked to stay. I'd also been asked to put on my gym clothes. When I dropped it on my desk, Mrs. Hutchinson, the principal's secretary, had picked up my shirt by hooking her pen inside the collar. She promptly dropped it into the wastebasket beside her desk, and then carried the wastebasket at arm's length as she ushered me into the principal's office. She left the wastebasket in the chair beside me and left the room in a huff. My notebook sat on the principal's desk, tastefully closed. Mr. Higgins, the principal, had walked me to the main office from the gym after a voice on the PA had instructed students to return to their last period classroom, and the halls were slowly cleared. Many teachers would be pleased to be getting some instructional time back, although I was hoping most of the students would be talking about what they saw in the gym, and teachers would have their work cut out for them, just getting kids to settle down. He left me with Mrs. Hutchinson and grumbled something about needing to be in the hallways to monitor dismissal and not having the time to deal with troublemakers. I figured, with the front of school clearing out, he'd be joining me in his office soon. Like I had imagined, Miss E going through the routine of exiting her plane and circling it before she left the barn. I mentally counted down the time it would take Mr. Higgins to walk down the hallway from the school lobby where he normally stood during dismissal enter the front office, and then join me at his desk. I wondered after I got down to zero and was still alone, but then I heard quiet voices outside the door. Mr. Higgins, loud and clear, but not in the same tone he used with me. Mrs. Hutchinson, barely audible. Yes, of course. And there was a third voice, one I had been expecting. When Mr. Higgins entered my office, my mother was at his side. He walked quickly over to the chair next to me and moved the wastebasket to the floor so she could sit beside me. Then, just as quickly, he moved behind his desk and planted himself in his chair. My mother sat down next to me without making eye contact. Mr. Higgins wasted no time. Mrs. Wells, I called you here this afternoon because, well, Elizabeth, would you like to tell your mother why you're here, or should I? I wrinkled my nose at the way he said my name. I was used to my mother calling me Elizabeth and my teachers, but hearing Mr. Higgins use my full name grated on me, like he was doing it on purpose to emphasize the fact that I was in trouble. But worse than calling me by my full name, Mr. Higgins had made the classic authority figure mistake. He'd given up his authority. By giving me the option of telling my mother what I'd done, he'd lost control of the story. Adults thought they were putting you on the spot, like it was some punishment to look a parent in the eye and tell them what you'd done. Maybe so if you were out at night knocking over mailboxes or sneaking into backyard pools. But if you hadn't done anything wrong, if you had done something you felt was right, something you decided needed to be done, where was the shame in that? So instead of listening to Mr. Higgins catalog all the school rules I'd broken and explain how I'd been a bad influence on all the other students, I turned to my mother and told her what I'd done. I wore the shirt that was covered in blood from the girl who'd been hit by the police when I went on the field trip to the riot in San Francisco. Mr. Higgins was instantly flustered, and I understood why. I put the blame on the police who hit the girl and the school for taking me to a riot scene. In my version of the story, all I'd done was wear my t-shirt to school. Well, Elizabeth, let's get our facts straight. You wore the shirt for the sole purpose of disrupting the pep rally and drawing attention to the unfortunate incident, an incident, I might add, that resulted in the prompt dismissal of the teacher responsible. Mr. Higgins seemed to be speaking without taking a breath, his voice getting higher and faster as he pressed on. Not only did we have to end the pep rally early, but I'll now need to send a letter home to every student's parents explaining the incident and making it clear that you standing up, wearing the shirt, and holding a war protest sign was not a scheduled part of the rally, and that the school in no way supports. My mother put her hand up, and Mr. Higgins' voice stopped instantly. It's a good thing. He seemed to be running out of air. He sat, mouth open, looking at my mother, frozen, as if the breath he'd kept himself from taking while he was talking was now stuck in his throat. Mr. Higgins, is your father currently serving in Vietnam? My mother said in a low, even voice. He stammered, still holding his breath. Your son? Or brother, perhaps? More stammering, still no breath. Mr. Higgins was turning red in the face, either from embarrassment or lack of oxygen. Do you think, Mr. Higgins, that if you did have a family member serving in Vietnam, that you would perhaps want the war to end? And that instead of shouting and clapping for a football team or a group of cheerleaders, that you might want your classmates and their principal to at least acknowledge that many sons and fathers and brothers in this community are currently risking their lives while serving their country? Mr. Higgins finally let his breath out and seemed to deflate in his desk chair. I had spent my time during dismissal preparing my arguments. Even the sentence I'd said when Mr. Higgins made the mistake of letting me talk first had been rehearsed and replayed in my mind. I was ready to defend myself and stand up for what I'd done, and I thought I might be able to win over my mother, but I wasn't expecting this. My mother stood up, and Mr. Higgins practically fell out of his chair trying to do the same. Now able to see into the wastebasket, my mother gestured toward it and asked in the same steady voice, "Is that my daughter's shirt?" Mr. Higgins' face went from red to white. He nearly jumped into the wastebasket himself, trying to quickly pull the shirt out. He offered it to my mother, and then, glancing quickly down and realizing he was handing her a bloody piece of clothing that had just been in the garbage, he pulled it back toward himself, briefly held it out toward me, and then started looking around for something to put the shirt in. I saved him the agony and just took it from him. We walked out of Mr. Higgins' office and past Mrs. Hutchinson without a word. My mother stood silently behind me while I gathered some of my things from my locker. The silence continued as we walked through the halls, and I started to wonder if my mother was truly angry with me, in spite of her coming to my defense just minutes ago. Then, as we exited the school building, my mother did something she hadn't done in a long time. She smiled at me. All right. That is the end of Mondays with Miss E for this week. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next week.